Do you like planes, explosions? What about the color orange? Or, hear me out, volcanoes? If any of these things interest you, even in the slightest, then boy have I found the game for you. Project Wingman. Initially funded as a Kickstarter and developed by a team of just 3 people, which is seriously impressive in its own right, this arcade flight combat sim is an absolute must-play for fans of the Ace Combat series of games, particularly those that are fans of Ace Combat Zero, the Belkan War, which Project Wingman seems to be heavily influenced by. And just a little disclaimer here, the purpose of this video is not to directly compare Project Wingman to Ace Combat, but more so to focus on Project Wingman as it stands on its own. Both games belong to the same genre, of course, so there's going to be tons of similarity. There are also going to be a few key differences that I'll point out that will require direct comparison, but I'm going to try to make it through without using the words Ace Combat as much as possible. So without further ado, let's see what Project Wingman has to offer. The game is set on a fictional version of Earth in the somewhat distant future during a time period known as After Calamity. Hundreds of years prior to the events of the story, humanity discovers a compound known as cordium, a resource produced deep within the Earth's mantle that has the potential to provide copious amounts of energy at the cost of being extremely dangerous and volatile. The material's discovery ultimately led to a devastating tectonic collapse, which resulted in the entire world being scorched, all but erasing humanity from existence. Civilization is rebuilt, essentially from the ground up, and in the After Calamity era, where we find ourselves, knowledge of the volatile substance is growing. Possession of cordium deposits is incredibly valuable due to the latent untapped potential of the compound. Surely there wouldn't be anyone out there crazy enough to try to weaponize this stuff, right? The story starts off by putting us in the shoes of a silent protagonist known as Monarch, an independent mercenary fighter pilot who flies at the head of the Sicario group's Hitman team. We first take to the skies off the coast of Florida as Sicario is wrapping up its current contract, having been tasked to deal with another merc group that's recently resorted to outright piracy. The game quickly establishes a few key elements. The first is that your allies are actually not entirely useless. As a matter of fact, the first thing you see as you fly towards your objective after starting the first mission is your allies taking out a target in front of you before you're even able to get a shot off at it. This earned a bit of a laugh for me as it happened, and I couldn't help but think that maybe it was done intentionally, as another very popular flight action game can be sort of notorious for having worthless wingmen. The second is your Rio, Prez.
Target down! Ordnance away! Right up! Fox 2! Enemy aircraft shot down!
As you play through the campaign, anytime you're flying in a 2-seater aircraft, such as an F-14, you get some company in the form of a non-silent weapons systems officer. She has a ton of dialogue throughout the game, enough to make you even consider bringing a worse aircraft to a mission rather than leaving her behind a base. The third is, maybe you could guess it, the color orange. Yep, right from the get-go, you're introduced to a taste of your soon-to-be favorite color palette as you destroy a cargo container of the aforementioned cordium. As the game's introductory mission is wrapping up, another merc group arrives on scene, explaining that they're making their way towards the nation of Cascadia. A war is brewing. The rest of the main story's 21 missions cover Sicario's involvement in a war that would go on to be known as the Cascadian Conflict. In it, the Federation, a world superpower that's sort of akin to a future United Nations, that is, if the UN used its political and military power to expand for its own goals, begins an attempt to seize valuable natural resources and geothermal deposits from the nation of Cascadia, resulting in the country withdrawing its allegiance from the multi-nation superpower. With you, the player, at the head of Hitman team as Monarch, you work to push back against the Feds and ultimately play a major part in tipping the scales of the conflict in favor of Cascadia. Just about everything you'd expect from a flight game like this is here. You've got your air-to-air missions, air-to-ground ones, big bad flying fortresses that sort of give off futuristic B-17 vibes, a healthy roster of aircraft to choose from, prototype enemy craft, enemy ace squadrons, and an antagonist who seems fixated on nothing else but watching the world burn. Yeah, for a game that would technically be considered indie by nature, this really has a ton to offer, especially for the low price of just $24.99 on Steam. Let's talk about it. One thing that really stood out for me across the entirety of my playthrough was the music. Composed by Jose Pavli, the game's soundtrack punches far above its class, delivering emotional, powerful music that seems to be the quality you would expect from a major AAA game. Here's some snippets of one of my personal favorites, Showdown. really can't say enough how perfect the music fits the mood of the story and flow of gameplay. Next, let's talk a little about that gameplay and how Project Wingman feels to play. Well, if you've played Ace Combat, you know what to expect. Controls are nearly identical, aircraft acceleration, deceleration, and maneuverability all feel very similar, although honestly, I think I prefer the flight model in Project Wingman to the latest entry in that other series. High G maneuvers, or the ability to hold down both bumpers and greatly decrease your turn radius, are absent, making dogfights feel similar to some of the older entries in the series that initially made me fall in love with the genre in the first place. That's not to say that there aren't any gravity-defying shenanigans that take place while in flight here, the means of using them are just a bit different. Although honestly, I think I prefer this game's take on them. In order to discuss that though, we're going to need to talk about Project Wingman's plane and equipment selection. One of the first things you'll notice when you go to select or purchase a plane is that the names seem slightly off. It's easy to see though why your MiG-29 is instead named an MG-29. It's to get around licensing issues, and I think it's a brilliant way to do so. Hell, they could have called it anything they wanted for all I care. If it looks and acts like a fulcrum, it's still a fulcrum in my books. Now, naming conventions aside, there's something else that may stand out when selecting an aircraft. It's one of the things that I think this title did better than its big competitor, special weapons. Here, we aren't limited to bringing just one special weapon with us on sortie. Aircraft have anywhere between 2 and 3 special weapon slots, with a few having just one, but those are by far the minority. So how exactly does this work? Well, it's super simple. When selecting your aircraft for a mission, immediately after selecting it, you move to a Selecting SP Weapons screen where you select what weapons to load onto what pylons or slots. Not all weapons are available on all available slots, although there are some that are available on multiple ones. So if you choose to select multi-lock air-to-air missiles for multiple pylons, you'll end up carrying double the amount of ordnance and be able to fire on double the amount of targets simultaneously. Using the F-15 that we have on screen here as an example, not only can we do that, but we still have room afterwards to equip either some unguided bombs or multi-lock ground missiles. Immediately after choosing your special weapons, you're also given an option to select a module. A lot of craft only have one selection available here, flares, which flares in Project Wingman are pretty damn powerful. They work in the way that you would expect them to work. If you have an incoming missile alert, you can pop some flares out to break the lock, preventing the missile from tracking and hitting you. What makes them so powerful though is that you don't have a set number available to you. Instead, they're on a timer. If you use flares for a short period of time, they're unavailable while their cooldown resets before becoming available for use again. This may seem a little too arcadey to some, but in games like this where you carry potentially hundreds of missiles on a single fighter, is being able to pop out 30 to 40 flares in a single sortie really that far of a stretch? Regardless of your answer, there's a reason flares are available in the numbers that they are. You're going to need them to deal with the onslaught of aggressive enemies you encounter in some of these missions. Their effectiveness will really make you consider whether or not it's worth switching to the other available module if you're using an aircraft that's capable of supporting it, the AOA limiter. I had a lot of fun with this one. In the same way that flares are a great defensive tool, the AOA limiter is a fantastic offensive one. I'm going to have to make another comparison to that other flight series here in saying that this module is sort of like Project Wingman's take on Ace Combat 7's ability to perform post-stall maneuvers. You know, those crazy maneuvers that make Sir Isaac Newton roll over in his grave? I'll say though that I prefer the AOA limiter for the sole reason of it giving you complete freedom. The maneuvers that you're seeing on screen here aren't any sort of fixed animation activated by pressing a combination of buttons. By braking and activating the AOA limiter, you're given the ability to manipulate your aircraft's pitch, roll, and yaw axis however you see fit, allowing you to pull off some crazy shots, stalls, or whatever maneuvers you can dream of. These equipment choices apply to all aircraft, so you're really given a ton of freedom in how you want to equip yourself to deal with the various enemies and situations you encounter while in mission. And no matter how you choose to equip yourself, one thing that's always present, no matter what aircraft you bring to the battlefront, are your guns. I'm a big fan of trying to go for guns kills in dogfights when possible, and I'm happy to report that Project Wingman's take on guns effectiveness helps me do just that. Guns are incredibly powerful, whether engaging air or ground targets. Honestly, they might be slightly too effective against larger ground or sea targets such as battleships, but against air targets, they feel right on the money. To top it off, you can supplement your basic guns with a pair of gun pods and really live out your fantasy of screaming across the skies, downing enemies with nothing but streams of explosive shells. Next, I'd like to briefly touch on the game's visual presentation. The game was developed using Unreal Engine 4 and looks damn good in my opinion. Explosions, missile trails, clouds, lighting, aircraft in their cockpits, they all look great. Any complaints I had were very minor, such as vapor trails generated off of certain aircraft being slightly out of alignment, for example. Overall though, the game's gorgeous and looks seriously impressive for a quote-unquote indie title. This is a good place to talk about performance in VR as well. I know in the past there were reports that the game had some performance issues, and I can say in larger battles it definitely still does. Even with a pretty beefy PC, I still noticed a couple slowdowns. It was by no means a big issue for me, but if you have a lower end PC, I could see some missions being a little rough as far as performance is concerned. Now as far as VR goes, well, unfortunately I can't report too much on it since I don't have VR myself, but I can tell you that the game's entire campaign is fully playable in VR, on PC at least, not just a specific set of missions. So if VR is something that interests you, that's another point in the game's favor. In addition to the game's main story mode, there's also a sort of roguelike game mode called Conquest. You choose from any of the game's difficulties when starting, and can also apply additional modifiers to make the enemies you encounter more difficult, or change other aspects of gameplay according to the rules of the modifiers you apply. The mode starts you off on a map that you then proceed to conquer, segment by segment, with each different region having a randomly selected objective, such as killing a certain score's worth of enemies, or taking out specific targets. After fulfilling the initial objectives, a squadron of more elite enemies spawns in that you have to take out. Once you eliminate these enemies, the mission's complete and you're rewarded with a number of credits and prestige that you can then spend to unlock additional aircraft to use or purchase allies to bring with you in upcoming missions. Things can get pretty crazy in this mode as enemies don't seem to ever stop spawning in. It can get quite challenging, especially on mercenary difficulty. If you die at any time, it's back to square one as you have to restart. You do get to keep any planes you unlocked via prestige, however, any allies that you purchase via credits to fight alongside you are reset back to 0. Now, due to time constraints, I wasn't able to spend a ton of time in this mode, but I did play enough of it to learn that one of the aircraft you can unlock has an equipable nuke. Check this out.
Ordnance away.
Conquest mode is definitely a cool way to add some replayability to the game, and I could see it taking quite a bit of playtime to fully unlock everything. Definitely a nice addition. Before we move on to discussing some final points I'd like to cover in a bit more detail, such as the antagonist's motives and the game's big cataclysm that occurs, I'd like to just give a brief spoiler warning, so you've been warned. Throughout the game, you face squadrons of enemy fighters, complete with their own cool intros when they arrive on scene. The most notable of these is Crimson Squadron and its leader, the main antagonist of the game, Crimson 1. Now, I'm gonna be honest here, I think this is where the game falls a little short of its main competitor. Since we don't really have actual cutscenes where we get to see and hear from Crimson 1 to truly get to know his character or motives, the only interactions we have with him are in the skies, and he sort of comes off as a stereotypical bad guy character who blames us for his problems and decides to decimate an entire city because of it. There's a lot of don't blame this on me energy with this guy. I wouldn't say that his character is bad, it's just nothing particularly special in my opinion. I didn't feel any remorse in shooting him down and didn't really feel personally connected to him or his motives in any way. Now, just because I found the game's antagonist to be a little shallow, that doesn't mean that the story is. I actually quite enjoyed the story as it played out in briefings and in missions. The cataclysm that happens in Mission 15 when the Federation decided that it would be a good idea to bombard an area that housed the dormant volcano with cordium missile after cordium missile was really unique and something that I honestly didn't see coming. It gave me feelings similar to those I felt when Belka decided to detonate nukes on their own soil, except instead of dealing with man-made weapons as we were in Ace Combat Zero, this go around we're dealing with the repercussions of messing with Mother Nature herself, and an entire swath of the globe felt the consequences of the Federation's actions. Pretty badass if you ask me. And the fact that there's a 2-month time skip that occurs after the event, essentially bringing the war to a grinding halt, really sinks in that feeling that the entire region was screwed over and decimated because of it. So overall, unless you have an aversion to the color orange, Project Wingman is a great buy, even at its full price of $24.99. If you can pick it up even cheaper, on sale, I think it's a steal. It's an absolute must-play for any fan of the genre. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game down below. This is Jarbo Gaming, thanks for watching, we'll see you on the next one.